War's biggest supporters have begun to get cold feet.
In fact, the Pentagon issued a dire warning about how climate change would become a far worse threat than terrorism. They predicted nuclear wars and rioting, entire countries flooded by rising sea levels, food scarcity and suffering. And the worst predictions are beginning to come true. Global CO2 levels just passed 400 parts per million, the highest seen in 800,000 years. We also had the worst year ever for global emissions. The Obama administration, by keeping us in a state of perpetual war, has made the world's environmental peril far worse. By continuing to extend the vast polluting fist of the U.S. military into the rest of the world, we've created a future rooted not only in hatred and revenge, but ecological disaster. In fact, according to Sanders, our modern military has already committed some of the greatest environmental atrocities in the history of human civilization, and they're not done yet. We'll be referring to data from Sanders' book frequently in this episode.
My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Many in the rest of the world are already feeling the direct environmental side effects of our militarized society in the form of radioactive soils, sick and dying children, and poisoned drinking water.
What is the age?
It's 4 years old. 1 year old.
1 year old. Yeah. Prognosis?
The prognosis is very bad. 80% die, mortality 80%. As we know, the DU may be transmitted by the wind and everything is contaminated now. The air, the soil, the food is contaminated by this material.
Thank you. Thank you.
To the Pentagon, clean air, clean water, and the lives of other species are just so much collateral damage. They see nothing but bleak and bitter struggles ahead of us.
More than any other institution I can think of in the world, the U.S. military's attention really has to be on all things at all times. They don't know where the next war is.
This enigmatic place is the sum of many parts and many people.
The Pentagon is more than just a building. It's almost like a living, breathing organism.
It is an institution as complex as any on Earth. A place of war, power, and tradition.
The military isn't them, it's us. We pay for it with our tax dollars and indirectly endorse its environmental atrocities. So let's look more closely at how those dollars are being spent. Occupying about 1,000 military bases around the world, the U.S. military's footprint on the Earth is huge. The Pentagon itself lists some 49,000 barracks, hangars, hospitals, and other buildings occupied by U.S. military personnel. Overall, these bases account for 30 million acres of territory worldwide, an area bigger than the entire state of Ohio. About 38 of those military bases are bigger and badder than the rest, used by naval fleets and airborne bombers. Back when Britain was an empire in 1898, they maintained 36 bases around the world. Even further back, in 117 AD, the Roman Empire kept 37 major bases active with which to keep most of Europe and Asia under their control. They both thought they were too big to fail too. The Pentagon is the largest single consumer of fossil fuels in the world, burning up to 20 million gallons of oil each day. In 1 year, our military burns enough fuel to run all of the trains, buses, and commuter rail systems in the U.S. for more than 20 years. The military doesn't care about fuel efficiency. With 4,000 or so combat vehicles crushing the earth at any given time, you can almost hear the giant sucking sound. A Humvee gets about 4 miles per gallon. But that's miserly compared to an M1 Abrams tank, which rumbles along at 0.2 of a mile per gallon. An Abrams in combat can burn 252 gallons in a single hour. These metal monsters, however, seem almost efficient when compared with our naval and airborne killing machines. Take any of our dozen or so active aircraft carriers. These floating hunks of metal can burn 100,000 gallons of fuel a day. Every time President Obama orders another aircraft carrier to threaten the waters of Iran or North Korea, we all pay for millions of gallons of fuel that could have been used to build solar panels or wind turbines or to power public trains. But it's the U.S. Air Force that really wins the fuel gluttony prize. An F-16 fighter jet burns almost 1,700 gallons per hour, more gas than the average American driver uses in 3 years. A single B-52 bomber, the Stratocruiser, requires almost 3,400 gallons of fuel per hour. That's equivalent to 6 years of driving for most of us. Our military maintains the largest armada of flying machines in the world, including 11 types of attack planes, 13 kinds of bombers, 16 models of cargo planes, 9 kinds of helicopters, and a growing number of remote-controlled drones and stealth bombers. To make things worse, the military has to transport all of that fuel to remote locations all over the globe. On average, they, or should I say you, end up paying about $17 per gallon for their fuel. But the bigger bill may be yet to come, in the form of global climate change.
It's all over the map, this heat. 106 degrees in Wichita, 98 in Milwaukee, Oklahoma City 106, 99 in Chicago. And while it seems to be going nowhere, this heat, it is in fact slowly sliding east, which is why the map, literally the map, has been in the headlines almost everywhere. Hot, hot colors we're not used to seeing. Triple-digit temperatures likely just ahead for New York, Philadelphia, Washington.
Not sure that I've ever witnessed anything like this before in my life. It just shows you the power of tornadoes, and scenes like this unfortunately have happened over and over this spring.
The military sends about 200,000 tons of CO2 pollution into the air every day. That's 10% of the entire world's contribution. They ignore EPA standards and burn something called bunker fuel, which is 1,000 times dirtier than diesel and deadly to fish and wildlife. It also leaves behind sulfur dioxide when burned, greatly magnifying global warming effects. And our military's toxic boot print on the Earth is far worse than simple CO2. It's a nightmarish brew of chemicals, solvents, and radioactive waste. We'll be right back.
Innocent people were targeted for killing.
Among those maimed and murdered, innocent children.
Slaughtered its own people, invaded 2 neighbors, attacked others, and engaged in chemical and environmental warfare.
Attempting to use innocent men, women, and children as shields for his own military. Our troops will have the best possible support in the entire world, and they will not be asked to fight with one hand tied behind their back.
You have my gratitude and the gratitude of all Americans. You have performed a difficult mission with courage and professionalism.
I want to begin by paying tribute to our men and women in uniform, who once again have acted with courage, professionalism, and patriotism.
To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you.
I ordered our forces to launch a cruise missile attack on the Iraqi Intelligence Service's principal command and control facility in Baghdad.
As I report to you, air attacks are underway against military targets in Iraq. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
We targeted tanks and military assets that had been choking off towns and cities, and we cut off much of their source of supply.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations.
We have done so because we know that our own future is safer, our own future is brighter, if more of mankind can live with the bright light of freedom and dignity.
My fellow citizens, the dangers to our country and the world will be overcome. We will pass through this time of peril and carry on the work of peace. We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail.
Our military bases around the world generate about 750,000 tons of nuclear waste every year. For years, the Department of Defense struggled to get rid of it. Then about 20 years ago, the Pentagon struck upon a brilliant, evil idea. Why not add that nuclear waste to bombs and bullets and lob them at the next country unfortunate enough to get in our crosshairs? Let's take a look at those famous shock and awe cruise missiles. Remember that night? Every 3,000-pound cruise missile carries 800 pounds of depleted uranium in its casing. During the first 2 days of Bush's Iraq invasion, we dropped 800 of these toxic killers on Iraq. That's 320 tons of radioactive waste vaporized on Iraq's soil in just 2 days. And that was just the beginning.
Heating up.
We dropped 4 enhanced GBU 2,000-pound bunker busters, satellite guided.
There's a large explosion.
They both came off, seemed to come off. I didn't notice anything adverse about it. I'd dropped bombs before.
Thousands of tons of other bombs, shells, and bullets made with depleted uranium followed. As a result, deadly radioactive particles have been spread across the landmass of both Iraq and Afghanistan, most of them small enough to be inhaled. Depleted uranium has a half-life, incidentally, of 4.7 billion years. The result, for the first time in human history, has been an act of permanent terrorism, what biologist E.O. Wilson calls omnicide, the destruction of all living things, animal, vegetable, and human. We have essentially killed or mutated every living thing in that part of the Middle East for the rest of time. Ever heard of Gulf War syndrome?
Professor Zigvat Horst Günther is on his way to Iraq. The 79-year-old is escorted by Ted Wayman, Deputy Director of the Uranium Medical Research Center in Toronto, Canada. 2 men looking for evidence that depleted uranium, DU ammunition, was used by the ton in the recent Iraq war. They're convinced it's responsible for Gulf War syndrome, which has now undermined the health of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. Nuclear waste is radioactive. It has to be stored in special containers and it needs to be guarded. And that costs money. A great deal of money when there's hundreds of thousands of tons to dispose of. So the nuclear industry was delighted when the military showed interest in its cheap uranium byproduct. The reason for that interest, uranium is one of the heaviest metals known to man, twice as heavy as lead. When a uranium shell hits a tank, it penetrates the steel armor as if it was made of paper. At the same time, part of the uranium round vaporizes and ignites inside the tank, causing the ammunition present to explode and kill the crew. This double action is what makes the weapon so appealing to military strategists.
Consider this. Soldiers who fought in World War I and World War II had a disability rate of just 5%. For the first Gulf War, the disability rate is now 56%.
Sometimes we think that it's easier to make war than to work to prevent it or to clean up after it.
The military is a major player in terms of environmental outcomes.
The environment is war's silent casualty. When we talk about the costs of war, we rarely focus on what happens to the land, the animals. We rarely focus on that which sustains human life.
We're completely out of sync now in defining threats to our security. At one time, the principal threats were military. They no longer are. They're now environmental.
In the Homeland Security Department, they're thinking about vulnerability and preparedness. We just haven't made the same commitment yet in climate change, but we really need to do that.
At the moment, it's as if we're sleepwalking into disaster. We can't afford to sleepwalk into the future. We must take decisions and action which create a world that we want our children and their children to grow up in.
The list of